Most of us see huge amounts of suffering, huge amounts of anxiety and trauma, dysregulated sensory issues, alcohol, vast amounts of suffering. And then you see people change most of the time over a few months. Massively. You're unattached to the suffering, you're unattached to the miracles because they're happening all the time around.
Who are you?
More than 25,000 at this point. That uniqueness that makes us both gifted and tortured.
I was opening up to a friend and he was just like, dude, everybody loves you, but like in my mind it can be like I feel like everyone probably hates me. Is everybody messing with me?
There's a very fine line between being deeply empathetic and a little bit autistic. It's just like a little bit, you don't have to be one or the other either. Once you understand that you have these quirky regulatory bits, and then you understand that many of them are tunable and changeable, man, that's sexy. That gives you this powerful agency. If you want an answer, go to a doctor. You want questions? Come to a scientist. We have questions for you.
Who are you?
I am Dr. Andrew Hill, founder of Peak Brain Institute. I'm a scientist/coach who teaches people how to understand their brains and move through making changes. I got a PhD from UCLA in cognitive neuroscience, all about understanding how the brain produces aspects of the mind and attention. I use tools including something called brain mapping, which is a measurement of resting patterns of brain waves. To understand, initially when I got into this work, I would help people understand their ADHD or their anxiety. And brain mapping, or quantitative EEG, is a measure of one person's brain compared to the average person. And so it's not a diagnostically precise experience of here's what's true for you. It's more like here's some stuff in your brain. That's true. And now here's what it often means. Here's what it can mean. But people are weird. So good job. Like the goal is not to get people to the middle of the bell curve or worry too much about why they're weird. It's to figure out if there's stuff in data that jumps out. And so I do this population level comparison looking for big features that are stable across time called phenotypes, biomarkers, trait features. And we also, just to make sure that it's more valid, more grounded in something that's easy to interpret, we always include an attention test alongside it. Also population compared. So I've been doing that thing, brain mapping, as part of both the clinical sort of peak performance and therapy kind of focused biofeedback practice, neurofeedback, in a company called Peak Brain that's been around for coming up on 11 years. And I ran another company before that for several years that had sort of a hybrid brain and addiction focus. And through working at UCLA, doing research for a while, and even before that, the perspective on what is going on for people changed. I used to work in really acute psychiatric environments, inpatient, before I was doing this work. And I've been doing this work for 20, 25 years, so a long time ago. And at that time, I would argue maybe even still, traditional allopathic psychiatric medicine doesn't really have a good handle on how to create change for people when they're dealing with acute stuff or developmental things. So severe anxiety, trauma, ADHD, autism, seizure. Like, we have some drugs, we have some therapies, but they're not that wonderful. And working in acute environments, I would see people revolving door coming through, getting stabilized, discharged into unstable environments, come back in. And I was working in teen, adolescent environments, inpatient, which was pretty brutal, seeing these kids get stabilized and then go back out into the community or the home where things weren't as stable and come back and get stabilized again. And so that did show me the plasticity, the ability that the kids especially had to rebound. But I did a lot of work with autism, a lot of work with severe developmental stuff, if you will. I worked in I ran a residential facility for a company called Meridian in the Northeast for a couple of years, where we had multiple adults living in the house who had no language, no typical communication skills. They were all, most of them were blind. Most of them were deaf. Different assortments of communication challenges and cognitive challenges. So really severe developmental stacked disabilities, if you will. And working in that environment, working inpatient, I had this perspective on people as, we're okay at managing some suffering, but not that great at making change. And then I got a job working at an autism center that used neurofeedback as its primary tool. And we had a lot of autism and ADHD kids and some adults. And I started seeing people change. I was like, well, wait a minute. This doesn't make a lot of sense based on what we know, based on what I've seen for 10 years. There's not a lot of change to be had as far as I knew with developmental things and basic aspects of regulation. And I was seeing change in weeks and months. And the tools we were using to see that were these attention testing, of course, self-report, teacher report, home report, etc., but also the brain maps. And seeing these phenotype patterns, the patterns for ADHD, the patterns that might represent anxiety, sensory difficulties, etc., it starts to give you this lens on somebody that's not psychiatric and it's not medical. It's a lot closer to a coaching practice where you're like, here's some data, here's some goals, and you have to kind of figure out what's going on for the person without being too tied into, is this a diagnostic language? Is there a clinical label? And the field of neurofeedback is mostly clinicians, mostly therapists doing therapy. And they do some neurofeedback alongside it or with it or instead of therapy. But it's a therapy relationship where the container's there, they're treating you, they've diagnosed you. And I started to realize that the brain phenomena we often pathologize and give diagnostic labels to is quirky and cramped up and different in people in many similar ways across diagnostic labels, across complaints, across problems, across gifts. And so you'll see the same area, front midline, for instance, might get in the way of controlling your focus, might overfocus or obsess or perseverate. But you also might have the ability to hold things in your mind like it's your job. And so my perspective on the brain shifted from one of diagnostic and pathology and developmental, labels into where are people now with their regulatory and developmental resources. And can you make change in those? Because apparently I was seeing people make change in executive function, sensory things, etc. So that started me down a long path and ended up studying how this neurofeedback stuff works in the brain. But the book that I've written, that I asked to come back on your podcast to chat about, is about this perspective we can all develop, understanding our brains, not from a diagnostic perspective per se, but understanding these dozen or so big cortical resources that might, across complaints and across gifts, might cramp up and provide a little bit of that uniqueness that makes us, both gifted and tortured. So that's the title of the book, Gifted and Tortured. So, yeah.
Yeah, and it's I was just talking to you a little bit before this, but it really is I think a beautiful book. And I think last time I had you on, we had a lot of the focus on, what makes a neurodivergent brain. Is neurodivergence a real thing? And to see that kind of fully manifest in this, this book in a lot of ways and kind of piecemealed into these different phenotypes. I think you refer to them as these different characteristics, the grumpy old man or the princess and the pea, and these different archetypes that we can relate to. In some ways, it kind of reminds me of parts work to a little bit, but almost tying those things to the brain in a very specific way, and the actual underlying patterns versus just the purely kind of psychodrama that we can have. And so I like the fact that it was connecting it to something a little bit more firmer in the biology, I guess, as well.
It's a little bit like an IFS meets the physiology that actually exists kind of landscape, but
yeah,
I'm sort of using metaphors to describe the actual function of the tissue underneath an area.
Yeah, that
keeps me a little bit grounded. So I really love IFS, and I'm a huge fan of most people that do it. But there can be a little bit of a development of the model. The model is nearly infinite for some people. How things operate, parts, etc., can be really quite variable. Brains are weird, but if you've got a part in your brain, generally it does the same thing at a high level as someone else.
Right.
So it, I think, gives people these touchstones that are real, that are true physiological resources that make sense to them, but give them another landscape beyond just it's part of this diagnosis, or it's part of this clinical bit of brain tissue. And this is something trying to give them a little expression of, here's the personality of that part of your brain. Here's how it might operate for you. As one of your parts.
Yeah, I'm curious because the focus of gifted and tortured, I think, is something we think about with all of these different artists, whether it's Van Gogh or whoever it is, and I can definitely feel very resonant with a lot of the different aspects you've talked about, and I've seen that with various people. And I'm curious, what was it for you that drew you to this work of all things in particular? Because there are so many, I'm sure there's so many things you've seen with the brainwaves. I know you've done the stuff with the psychics and like, more recently with the Acid for Squares pod and like doing a lot of that kind of work too, and high performance things. So like why neurodiversity? Why, gifted but tortured? Like why is that kind of the focus or crux of your work right now?
So, as I sat down again and again and again, telling people about what brain mapping is, explaining what brains do, how their brain might work, a lot of that process is not, here's what I know about you. It's more like, here's what shows up in data, how much of this is valid, how much of this is important. And, here's how brainwaves work in a part of the brain, but how that feels, I don't know, but here's how it often cramps up or gets in the way. Oh, that sounds relevant. Okay. We don't necessarily have diagnostic precision, i.e. truth. We have agency. And so in that process, to give you some sense of scope, I do usually well over 100 of these a month. Reviews of data, sitting down with people, looking at data with them, and they're almost all cold off of data without any real history. They're saying, here's your brain, here's your performance, let's talk about what this can mean. And 99 out of 100 of them, people are like, oh my gosh, there's lots of things there that are true and I care about. That's really interesting. And so you can learn a lot from many people looking at this data, but it's not exhaustive. The map is not the territory here, like anything. But in sitting people down and doing that, being like, oh, here's this posterior cingulate that might be your lifeguard. She might be in high gear because she's learned the world isn't especially safe. And now you're looking for sharks in the indoor pool. The princess in the pea behind the right ear that brings in the sensory and the social world and understands the line between you and the world and helps you manage that line to not take things in as much and any more than you might want to. So you can stand under a jet engine if you prefer, or listen to mosquitoes out in the forest. You can do both things. The ear has a cochlea that stiffens up to manage that gain, but the sensory and social tissue also has the ability to ramp up its sensitivity and ramp it down in most of us. For some of us, that's wide open floodgates coming in, a fire hose of social and sensory. And that's when the princess in the pea is bothered by the environment, But the same resource behind the right ear, the right tempoparietal junction, that whole cluster of tissue as a sensory and social junction box, also gives us the ability to be sensitive to other people's emotions on their face and understand their tone of voice and get that sort of intrinsic outside world as it relates to the self, as it relates to the social, the sensory. So knowing this, take somebody with a sensory issue, let's say, or some threat sensitivity, and it gives them a different mental framework that's not invalid. I'm not dumbing it down saying, oh, it's not in the way, or you're beautiful the way you are, don't worry about your suffering. I love the idea of things like neurodivergence and ADHD as a gift, as having upside. But that's a very complicated topic, and it's not meant to, understanding the nuance of it, some of the upsides, some of the downsides, is not meant to, should not be meant, in my opinion, to sort of assuage the reality of some of those bits of suffering and dysregulation. So, but we don't have to pathologize. If you have a quote unquote, ADHD or some other big alphabet soup of things attached to you, that might be useful if you're a kid and that helps you with an IEP, or if you're, somebody who needs a little extra time at work or something, that might be useful as the accommodation. But I think the labeling can disempower people and help them, just kind of go with this, oh, I have anxiety, I have PTSD, I have OCD, I have ADHD. Well, your brain's regulating that way, and a lot of that's built in, and some of it's acquired or developed against the world that's prickly or uncomfortable, but it's changeable. We have tissue in our brain that is not meant to change. It's hard to change the visual tissue at our advanced age. After age 6 months, we can't converge vision. So if you don't have good visual convergence, you won't ever get it. Or accents, speech sounds. If you haven't heard a speech sound by age 9 or 10, you won't hear it generally. Your brain's like, not important. The world isn't changing enough. But attention, sleep, anxiety, social processing, the world's changing constantly. That tissue's not locked down the same way that vision or other tissues are. So once you understand that you have these quirky regulatory bits, and then you understand that many of them are tunable and changeable, man, that's sexy. That gives you this like powerful agency, and you start like, oh, what can I do? I can hack my sleep. I can meditate. I can take supplements. I can do neurofeedback. And the book, this book came out of that perspective of, this is not about coming to a diagnostic precision. This is about teaching you how your brain works, and out of that, you'll understand. You'll understand it. That's the thing about brain mapping, and what I've tried to bring up in the actual book here. I have a physical, it really exists. Physical.
Congratulations. When did you get the physical books finally?
Pages and all. I have the final batch coming early next week, but I've done. This is a proof copy that I'm like double checking all the spacing and all the little,
Yeah.
Because I don't want to order a bunch of those until I'm sure it's right. But we're releasing on April 14th, so depending when the podcast comes out, it might be right around that time. And if I have a few, the website for the book, giftedandtortured.com. I am doing a small run of author copies where we sign them and send them out. We've already sold a bunch of those, so there'll be some left, I think, next week.
Cool.
And the week after. But so grab one of those if you want. Otherwise, Amazon will have paperbacks and ebooks. And if folks are curious about this idea of these phenotypes, I've mentioned a few of them: the princess and the pea, the CEO, the lifeguard.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you want to kind of walk us through what those are really quickly, and just so people have a primer, and maybe connect them to like the ways that people typically maybe associate with those things, whether that's ADHD or how they might blend or not blend.
I mean, I could run through them all. There's a lot. I encourage folks that are curious about the top 3 for them that might drive it. Go to the website. There's a quiz at giftedandtortured.com. You can run your own little phenotype quiz and see which of the top 3 are likely to be in the way or likely to be interesting for you. But you can. I think about them regionally, and imagine a plus sign on top of your head, with one part of it going ear to ear, one running down the middle, front to back. And the front to back are involved with stabilizing your attention under demand. The one in the front helps the inside self. Helps the thought stream, a very high level, what you're thinking about, your cognitive appraisal, what you care about. And I think of it as the CEO, the part that's assembling the incoming and output information for a lot of the other parts of the brain. We call it the anterior cingulate more officially. The posterior cingulate in the back of the brain is the outside world. So the posterior cingulate acts a bit like a lifeguard going, watch the road, heads up, heads up. And if we learn the world isn't especially safe or predictable, your lifeguard starts getting activated because the cost of missing danger is high. You miss a tiger once, if you're lucky. You can miss yummy berries 3 or 4 times. Not a big deal. There's more berries probably, and the cost, at least, the opportunity of getting more berries is there. So we're very attuned to develop that threat sensitivity, a negativity bias. Left and right on the plus sign. The left side is a stabilizer of resources, and the right is a supervisor of resources. These are involved with executive function and sleep. The one on the left will help put you in gear and keep you in gear if you need to stay focused when you're bored because you're doing the thing. Don't wander off into the bushes if you're driving. That's the left side, left precentral gyrus. The pre and postcentral gyrus, the division between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe right there, it's the most posterior part of the frontal lobe. It's also receiving all the ascending information from the body and sending down all the controlled information into the body.
So is that like the supervisor part of it?
The supervisor and the stabilizer, yeah. The pre- and post-central gyri left and right. It's the mind-body connection, the mind-body control.
Wow.
And so they send information forward, largely, and we have in the front left corners, and so the CEO's in the middle, but the CEO has to sort of reconcile incoming information from the corners and the stabilizer and supervisor, who want to hit the gas and the brakes, essentially, are sending information in. When there's difficulty with the stabilizer, we become inattentive and don't stay asleep at night. When there's difficulty with the supervisor, we don't inhibit and go squirrel. The supervisor is supposed to read the map and say, hey, we're going to adjust up ahead. And so we can plan and adjust. And it's gently inhibitory. In the front, we have similar, go versus stop, but they're more about how we feel, the cognitive appraisal, the perspective on things. So the front left is like a happy little kid who sits on the porch and goes, hi, yay, hey, can I do that? That looks so cool. That's new. What's that? The approach system, the engagement system. The front left is a system that's supposed to evaluate for the difficulty and annoyance of things and go, this all sucks, go away, leave me alone. This is the grumpy old man, the happy little kid, the grumpy old man. The ratio between them is kind of important. If they're both out there doing their job on the porch, the world is dealt with as it needs to be, based on how rested and interested and safe and whatever else you might feel. But if the world is not that forgiving or too stressful or doesn't let you develop some resilience or some curiosity, the happy little kid on the left doesn't want to go outside and play. The grumpy old man's out there with no one to balance and starts, finding things really negative at best. And at worst can start catastrophizing and being filled with dread, the fact that things are too much and they're overwhelming. So the frontal asymmetry, the left versus right balance, can be involved with things like mood and motivation and resilience under stress. So we have the happy kid and the grumpy old man, the stabilizers and the supervisors. We go back a little bit further. On the right, we have the princess and the P, the right TPJ. And the left, we have a lot of receptive language areas, like call the interpreter, who's like listening for language, parsing out meaning. That'll help you parse out meaning in a busy room full of people talking to each other. So if you can't do that super well without getting distracted, that's that area. It'll also help you understand what you are saying in real time. So you can speak fluently and assemble words in sentences and spit them out. That uses a little area in the front, a sort of a secondary phenotype who only gets a mention in the book called the speaker. Because the interpreter, the posterior language, receptive language is most of language in us. It's the concepts, the grammar, the constructions, those are all posterior phenomena.
Well, I always remember like when I was diving into like, I was working for a neuroscience company and going into all of the different ways that like memory works and even just verbal memory, right, and processing, where it's like, oh yeah, you have the thing that interprets it, the thing that stores it, the piece that like knows what you want to say, but then there's also the thing that lets you actually be able to say it, right? So there's like all of these different little mechanisms that go through it, where it's like there's so many different links in the chain where somebody might have it interpreted, they know what they want to say, but for whatever reason they can't actually even just like verbalize that piece out because that part of it is jammed up or stuck or overstimulated or whatever it might be.
Yeah, or not synchronizing. In a QEEG, your alpha waves might not be the same speed in the left hemisphere, might be slipping. And what that means is the idling speed of the different cars sitting at the start line are not all the same. So you try to have a thought or produce a little bit of a sentence, and all the cars start up at different speeds and don't hand back the information properly as you start to use language. So you're like, what's that guy's name? I know that name. And it shows up 5 minutes later. That's an alpha speed. It's a tiredness of the mind, tiredness of the speed. People often think it's memory. And so again, phenotype phenomena. If your alpha speed is slow, this is the timekeeper. It's sort of sitting there, just kind of chugging along in a neutral background idle, like a car idling. And if that slows down, that's your speed of processing. And that's your short-term memory for some people. If it gets really bad, it feels like you're driving the car with the handbrake on, and it gets in the way of motivation and mood, because who wants to drive? It's so much work. Leave me alone. Yeah. So this just gives people, as a different way to, validly but non-pathologically conceptualize some of these resources, and once they know how these are working, I think the next step is it gives people things to do, agency, different and in the book I cover some of that. There's practical outcomes. This is not like a pitch to go do neurofeedback, although you can, and you can regulate these things with neurofeedback. But every single thing that I talk about, I think, I give life hacks, I give meditation practices, I give some perspective on what's most important in terms of like modifiable behavior you can play with, so that people can both understand themselves and then immediately have something they might want to do to regulate, better, to take control over the regulation.
I think one of the things that I noticed in there and has popped up with a couple of different other neurofeedback clinicians that I've spoken with and people within that space is it sounded like the bedrock for just about everybody was sleep, right? That getting and knocking out sleep, especially in our current day and age. I forget which one it was that came on, but she was talking about how almost if you look at like our SMR frequency need right now, or like where it is for most people, it's like almost all people are fitting into like what used to be the ADHD kind of spectrum because of how our sleep is being affected, or maybe it's affecting our sleep. I don't, it can be either or, but yeah.
There was an old paper, one of the seminal papers in neurofeedback by Vince Monastra that came out that talked about the theta-beta ratio being fairly predictive in an adolescent population for ADHD. I mean, really predictive, like 94% predictive in classic ADHD and 81% predictive alpha over beta. So high alpha is inattentiveness, stuck in neutral. That's ADD, quote unquote, although grossly oversimplified. High theta, disinhibition, squirrel, ADHD. You can have both. The theta beta ratio was super predictive in this population, and then every couple of years, someone would try to replicate it. A grad student or someone else, someone at the conferences would come up with another theta beta ratio study of a similar size, and it like systematically eroded over about 5 or 6 years. You literally saw the predictive value of that statistic drop away into the place where it just vanished against the noise floor of everyone having high theta relative to beta in the population. So the adolescents, there was like a high school or college, I forget who was doing this, probably a college at UTK, I would guess, being Monastra. So they did this work, and you saw that the sleep deprivation status of these young people just got worse every year. So the theta beta ratio, the ADHD-ness of it all, climbed to eclipse, the sleep climbed to eclipse that same signature. So this is why you can't diagnostically say, high theta beta ratio, you have ADHD. Yeah. You can say, your left side has lots of alpha and theta. The left side's a stabilizer of executive and sleep. Often people are inattentive. I did an attention test for you. You were a space cadet. You're inattentive. That makes sense. Hey, often people can't stay asleep at night because this also turns off attention. So you can stabilize the quality and architecture of sleep in the same region of the brain. Do you have trouble staying asleep? Oh, you do? Okay. Not sure it's related, but it's sure plausible. Okay, here's 3 tricks for sleep maintenance.
Yeah.
So it brings you a place of action versus a place of like, here's my diagnosis. And that's what I really like about brain mapping. And just the concepts involved. Again, I've given you a little workaround with the quiz to avoid doing QEEGs if you want, just to give you a few senses of the big pieces. But the agency provided by this, I think, is really useful for us. I mean, go back 20 years. You're old enough, I think. The word neurodivergence.
Yeah.
Neurodivergent.
Doesn't exist.
Now it's powerful, and people identify with it. It has use. It has utility. It's not a perfect label. Not everyone likes it, but it gives people some sense of identity. That is different than I have autism, is different than I have ADHD or I have depression, I have some anxiety.
Yeah, something's wrong with me.
Seizure disorder. Yeah, it's more reflective of you're an unusual flavor of human.
Yeah,
and guess what? Humans are weird, so
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think especially when you have like high functioning people with these traits in one way, shape, or form. And like I remember when I was, I finally went through an ADHD assessment with a therapist. And he was asking me all these questions, and I was just talking with another friend who went through a similar assessment, and they were like, "Oh, do you forget like your keys all the time?" And I was like, "No, but I used to, but I don't anymore because I have a cool cloud keychain where they go every time, and so I know where they are every single time, right?" And it's like, "Oh, well, like do you have a hard time?" When
but I would,
but
exactly. I would if I didn't have that accommodation, yeah, exactly.
Right. Or it's like, do you struggle with like staying attentive to things that are boring? I was like, kinda, but like I just kind of set up my life so I don't really do a lot of things that are boring. Like I outsource all of those things, and my life is very intentionally designed around that.
Do you have trouble sitting still in your cubicle? I have a walking desk, and I'm like talking on YouTube all the time, dudes. That's like you're playing to your strengths.
Right. So it's like I put my world together around my ADHD-ness or around my neurodiversity, right, and then figured out how to do it. But then there are still those suffering pieces, and I think that's something I really appreciate about the book and about you and this work as a whole is there is the gifted and tortured part, right? And feeling sort of validated in both of those, right? That it is not just there are these really cool things, but sometimes it's also hard to express. Like, yeah, I can feel a lot of pain in a way that's like hard for me to describe or share with somebody. I mean, I remember being recently at a festival, and I was opening up to a friend, and he was just like, dude, like everybody loves you, but like in my mind, it can be like, I feel like everyone probably hates me, or what if I'm, my 3 things, just to kind of let you know about them, and we can go wherever we want with that. We're like the happy little kid, the lifeguard, and the princess and the pea. Like those were my 3 strongest ones. And like that ability to, really, I guess that was like the rejection sensitivity like really resonated with me on one hand, and then also that sense of being able to be highly attuned on one hand to people's experiences, but also I don't know if it's when that gets lost or gets overwhelming, all of a sudden I feel like, is everybody messing with me? Did I miss some cue? Did I not see the right thing? And I start to feel frozen and collapse, and just like my whole world starts to collapse in on itself in a sense.
Yeah, that's your princess in the P on the back right. The outside world is back of the brain. Yeah. And you're probably extra sensitive right up into the moment that tissue's saturated, and then you can't process all the information. You're probably picking up too much, and it's a bit, like there's a very fine line between being deeply empathetic and a little bit autistic. Where you're not picking up the social, and it's just like a little bit,
Yeah.
But you don't have to be one or the other either. Some people are both. Some people are deeply empathetic and they take things literally sometimes.
Yeah.
I'm just saying. This is you. But like, that's the right tempo parietal. There's also a little structure next to the grumpy old man. There's the inferior frontal gyrus, who I affectionately dubbed the problem child. And the problem child wants to like be disruptive and oppositional for its own sake in some ways. Leave me alone. Like, be disruptive, push the thing, be negative, be oppositional. It's like a more vulnerable version in some ways of the negativity bias, and it's related to that stuff, but it has a very reactive and attachment kind of stuff too, because it's so young, that it can yield behavior, lead to behavior like blowing up your relationship by being a jerk just because you were bored.
Right.
Or because you're a little uncomfortable, so you're oppositional. So that kind of stuff can lead to some dysregulation. But otherwise, we notice that we want to go, and useful to know that stuff happens. So,
yeah, being like aware of when you want to push someone away and when that's going to serve you or not, right? And being able to have a level of relationship with that, I think, is huge. Yeah. I'm curious for you, even like, were there pieces of this that like really resonated with you in some way, shape, or form, where you're like, oh, that piece really felt like me once you started kind of even identifying this stuff for yourself in the book?
I mean, this is not nonfiction. This is definitely this is not fiction. Definitely a nonfiction, self-help style book.
Right.
But I think even then, there's something where all the characters are the artist, or are the author in some ways. So yes, but no, but sure, absolutely, all of these things. You'll discover. I mean, you read the book, but I talk about these things in a very different way, I think, than many people. Even my other neurofeedback providers, colleagues, friends of mine who are psychologists and neurologists and things, have said to me things like, you think about this stuff in an interesting way. And, I think that's a compliment for most of them. So,
if you're interpreting right. Yeah.
Right. I think so. Well, they're all therapists, so you can't tell. Like, if they were insulting you might not be able to tell. You might be like, oh, wow. But there's a different way of interacting with our brains than just, here's the giant label that sticks to us. And I think that's something I've identified with my whole life, is not fitting into. I mean, I was born in the 70s and grew up, teen years were mostly the 80s. ADHD was a thing, but it was like, not a very widely applied diagnosis. There wasn't a lot of medication yet. Not like the 90s where it became, de rigueur and everyone was on Ritalin and then Adderall a decade later. And that's still happening now. But I ended up sort of, getting through, raw dogging life without any of the diagnostic language, just being quirky, having trouble with, laundry and bills, having trouble with social stuff, impulsivity, not fulfilling my promise academically initially. And it was, kind of challenging. Got a diagnosis of ADHD after undergrad and went, okay, great, but I would love to do something different for, more. Medicine, psychology, something, nursing, I don't know, something. And then I worked in psychiatric hospitals and acute environments, because that's a great place to be, dynamic, changing environments. If you have a lot of ADHD, you can be super chill and walk around and see all the patterns and keep things safe. Perfect. But but I kept bumping up against this thing about like, well, I can't go back and do low intensity grad school for a bunch of years or intense med school for 3 to 5 years. I barely made it through boring undergrad, and that last year was tough, just kind of, getting stuff done. So the perspective on that was the perspective on my own, tortures and gifts and things was pretty complicated, where I knew that I was, creative and quick and intelligent, but also knew that I had a really hard time finishing up undergrad, and the idea of taking on huge projects.
Yeah.
As somebody in their mid-20s at that point, was like, okay, well, I don't know. And so I ended up working in those crisis environments for a while. And toward the end of that, I may have mentioned this on the last show, but toward the end of that time, I got injured. And I couldn't keep working in the acute psychiatric, so I went and did some high-tech work for a couple of years. Missed working in with people, and since I had a lot of developmental psych, autism, et cetera experience, went and got a job at an autism center, did neurofeedback, saw amazing things, and would hang out after hours and train my own brain. And after about a month and a half of training my brain, I was like, well, wait a minute. I'm feeling very, very different, and I think I can do something more. And that led me to going and getting a PhD studying neurofeedback to figure out how it works. Very meta. That's how you get through a grad program if you have ADHD, right? Because the joke is a PhD is the process of learning more and more about less and less until you know everything about nothing. Right. So, you have to niche down. You have to be driven, be pulled, be pushed by the thing you care about. And I would say if you have ADHD or something else where you're a little distractible or have some executive function difficulties, you need that even more. You need the structure of the external pulling you through, or you need other things helping, drive you through it. And that can mean changing your brain with neurofeedback or meditation. That could be supplementing with some nootropics or even medications. There's lots of ways to take control. There's life behavioral scaffolds, there's Pomodoro techniques, and at that time getting things done, and super useful. And I used them in grad school. But doing neurofeedback and knocking my ADHD back from like 200% of average, just ADHD down to like 20%, where it became this mild thing that I could, very easily not have to deal with in a lecture or a presentation or something, or having to grade a whole bunch of student papers. I could do that thing if I needed to, because it gave me as much control over my executive function as something like Adderall, or Ritalin would have more, actually. I've tried those things. So for me, it was a changing relationship with this stuff, understanding it and gradually getting a sense of it. But it was also changing the ability to change this stuff that started to get out. And so for the past 25 years, a lot of my, speaking from the mountaintop is about shift happens, take yours, get your brain, you can do stuff. And it's been a very neurofeedback kind of focused process, but this is to take it beyond that for folks who don't necessarily have access to an EEG or who aren't interested in doing neurofeedback and just want to understand their brains, because the understanding may yield the change sometimes.
Might be enough to have that pivot. Yeah. I'm curious for just your own experience when you said that when you're going through the ADHD stuff for yourself before neurofeedback, you had tried Ritalin or different medications, and then you eventually find neurofeedback, and like this thing is working and shifting for you. Like, what was that experience like? I mean, I know it was a long time ago, I guess, at this point, but what was that experience?
Oh no, I remember.
Like?
No, okay. I remember. Because it's not that dissimilar from what happens, I would say, about 2/3 of the time with ADHD. There's one of these quality moments that I'm going to describe. And I've been training my brain for about 18 sessions. I was at a camping trip in upstate Massachusetts and was walking to go somewhere. And I was like on a path, in the woods. And I remember walking. It's a path. It's a camping trip I'd done with friends every year for like 10 years. And it was a little annoying part of camp you have to walk to. I was walking there. I just remember being like, wait a minute. Why is everything so quiet around me? Why can I pay attention to everything? Things are really clear and, both crisper and more low key at the same time. And it's very, very similar to like putting on a new pair of glasses. If somebody has some vision issues, you're like, oh yeah, edges. That's right. Leaves. They have edges. You know, you get this little extra clarity, and it's kind of like if someone's taken Adderall, taken Ritalin, there is a quietness that creeps in. If you're somebody who has classic ADHD, lots of theta, you take a stimulant, it will quiet your mind generally. And it was very much that, but not a drug effect. And in the field of neurofeedback, the SMR training, which is the core frequency that the field was built on, sensory motor rhythm. If you've seen a cat on a windowsill, you've seen SMR. It's this liquid body and laser-like focus, completely inhibited in the body and still in the mind, poised. If you bring up your SMR, you will get more self-control. But if you're not used to having lots of SMR, if you have tons of theta taking over for it instead, and you're kind of fidgety and twitchy and ADHD, the first time your SMR comes up strongly for a few hours, it's like someone cleaned the windshield. You're like, oh, okay. And it's easier to think, and it's quieter, and you can, and here's the fun part. You don't lose anything. You can still move into like playing the video game or being the best athlete on the court or being the artist. You're not stuck in a mode the way that a stimulant might quiet the system, but like make you chew your lip and not want to eat and put you in one mode. This doesn't put you in a mode. It gives you access to the modes. You can kind of reach for that quietness when you wish, and you're suddenly more balanced.
That's something that I've heard, and even with the neurofeedback that I've done, like experienced as well. And I'm curious about that. Like, what is it about what neurofeedback does that makes it more of like an adaptive trait that you can switch on and off versus like a change, right? Because to your point, like I think most of the time when we think about things, it's like, oh, I'm going to get this thing, but I'm going to lose that. Like everything has its cost, everything has its benefit, da da da. But there is something similar where it seems like you're able to keep the core or the pieces that you want with this thing but get the benefits of focus without losing the creativity and the insight and the joy and the other parts that come with it.
That's usually true. Couple things on that. One, it's not a zero-sum game. You're making brain cells your whole life. Half the brain cells you make don't survive into true cells. They get reabsorbed in part of the metabolic process. The other half differentiate into the cells they're going to become and create networks with friends, and that's what saves them. That's what creates the information flow or the new cell patterns. So we have the ability to reshape our brains constantly. That's sort of the probably one of the more important aspects to this. But when it comes to neurofeedback giving you something without taking it away, most of the things that are complaints, suffering, deficits, anxiety, trauma, OCD, twitches, seeing patterns everywhere, seeing emotions everywhere, those are gifts unless you can't turn them off, unless you can't control them. You can have the strongest bicep in the world, but if you're walking around flexed and can't put your arm down, not useful, not regulated. And so most of the phenotypes we see that are stuck in high gear or that are not relaxing or doing something other really unusual and statistically that are in the way, they're not a disease process. They're a stuck mode that the tissue wants to be in sometimes, but not all the time. So if someone's got some OCD, intrusive thoughts, and perseverating, or even just songs in their head all the time, or biting your nails, you'll have tons of theta, let's say, for songs or nail biting, tons of theta brain waves, front midline usually. And if you bring that down, you'll still be able to summon a song up and, hear lyrics in your head. If you can do that, you won't have to. So it gives you the ability to control the tissue because it breaks it out of the stuck mode it's in, the cramp or the resource dysregulation. It builds resilience, builds some strength. You can tune it a little bit. The other piece of it is that neurofeedback, I think when done well, is an iterative process that is tuned by your feedback, no pun intended. Your own, like, oh, hey, I kind of noticed something. I was kind of chill after that. That was nice. Means something. As does, hey, I was kind of on edge. I didn't sleep as well after that session. That also means something. And you have to sort of iteratively, gently sort of coach someone's brain to move over many, many sessions. And so it ends up being personal training with the person's experience validating what you're doing as you go. So it's kind of an odd, neurofeedback when done well, I think is somewhere between fitness and psychology and medicine and being a mechanic.
Yeah.
You know, you're helping shape change, but the person knows better than the therapist what's going on. The person knows what their goals are better. Even when you read a brain map, I teach people to look at their own QEEGs. By the second or third one, they are reading the nuanced changes that they have been feeling better than I could ever hope to.
Wow.
So, you know, that perspective gives people individually the choice, the agency to pursue the change they're looking for. That gives you the ability to go, oh, I was more creative after that one. I want more of that. I was super focused, but not as creative after that one. I don't like that. Oh, okay. And since it's not permanent right away, you have the freedom to sort of build up effects and go, oh, that's a nice effect. Let's tune it. Well, that's a little pushy. Let's back off on that one. And the recipient, the person training their brain, is the person validating the reality of that. So as long as they're like reporting and giving good feedback, and the provider is integrating that feedback into the approaches, you can always, you know, you don't have to be perfect in your communication. You have to understand the diagnosis perfectly. You're steering phenomena and resources. So it's a fun process to work on people's brains that way.
Yeah, no, I'm that circles to a question that I was really curious about, and kind of as I was absorbing the material for the book, is like, you know, on one hand we have all these different aspects, like our happy little kid, our princess and the pea, these, you know, different parts of our brain, that we have that parts work kind of approach in a sense, right, with the different aspects. And then there is also this, I don't want to call it an other thing, because I don't know if it's an other thing, but like, to your point, there's also like the person, right? And I think the self, or whatever that is that you want to talk about, where there's a part that's going like, yeah, go in that direction, or, you know, the orchestrator of the whole thing that says like, yeah, I want it to go this way. Or even if we're not using neurofeedback, like you've said, like, oh, I want to develop this. And so it almost sounds like that, and maybe this is just a breakdown of human language, but there's that like and I guess my question to you is like, who is that, like, that is interacting with all the other ones? You know what I mean?
It's a great question.
That piece.
I don't have an answer to that. It's a great question though. I'm not sure how I feel about consciousness. I think the more we learn about it, the less we understand. You know, we're not just a bundle of drives. We're not just a bundle of individual resources. And yet, you know, we're having a hard time understanding what could be beyond that. You know, there's some dark corners yet in the science and in the spirituality that we just haven't figured out. And I would argue, not to push back on your question or be dismissive at all, but I would argue that it doesn't matter. Because what matters is, it's kind of a Buddhist perspective, what matters is not the meaning of life. What matters is reduction of suffering. If you have ways to reduce suffering, does it matter if you're in line with the cosmos? I don't know. You're able to help somebody suffer less or yourself suffer less, great. And when it comes to the brain, my perspective is almost agnostic when it comes to lots of these things. The diagnoses are not precise. They don't match people, and their suffering and their goals don't match diagnostic labels half the time. And yet, there's real stuff there. They're really experiencing things. Or these psychics, you know, from Tyler Henry or Susan Glau, you know, a handful of others. I don't know what's happening, but they're experiencing something. They're doing something. You can measure it. It's a thing. It's happening. It's a phenomena. And while doing that phenomena, they're interacting with people around them in a different way than is typical. To me, the joy of that is not like, can I figure out what's happening when Tyler does his thing or Susan does her thing? It's, oh, look, I showed a person a phenomena happening inside themselves that they didn't visualize before this, that they will understand in some deep way. It'll resonate. You know, showing Tyler the blob of theta or Susan the blob of delta that they make during the process. They were both like, oh yeah, I am a little bit like that. Wow, yeah, that is how I feel. And that was resonant. So they got validation or some fun experience with it, going, oh, that's kind of cool. In the first one with Dr. Drew, you know, Drew went off and was like, oh, I think this means that we have this theory, and then therefore people are tied into other people this way. And that's great. That was how Drew wanted to run with the ideas. Tyler was like, that's cool. I'm seeing something. I've been experiencing it for 30 years. And I was like, data. Hey, you know, you kind of look like other psychics I've seen, other spiritualists who have the ability to go into altered states semi at will, which is unusual. You have that skill. We're seeing it. That's kind of cool. Not sure what it means,
Yeah.
but the phenomena is there, and that's really the role that I serve, is helping people unpack their phenomena. They make the meaning. So I don't want the diagnostic precision or responsibility. Yeah. You know, my joke is, if you want an answer, go to a doctor. You want questions, come to a scientist. We have questions for you, for your data. You'll maybe know the answer, or you can ask questions of your doctor and get answers, or get medications, or get diagnoses.
Yeah.
But if you walk into your doctor's visit knowing how your brain works,
yeah,
you're going to get better answers.
I think that's like, you know, it's interesting because interviewing so many of you, if you will, of the various neuroscientists who work in this space, it's so fascinating how many of you all have developed in some way a Buddhist-esque perspective. And I don't want to put that language on your own, but like, you know, in some level of a meditative, you know, I think Jay Gunkelman identifies as a philosophical Taoist, right? And like these.
Oh, okay, that makes sense for Jay. Yeah. Sure.
And there's a quality to, I think, almost all of you where it's like you're engaging with this kind of material. And I think it was Dr. Othmer who was talking about just, you know, the mysteries of physics, and that begin the same thing with the brain. Like as you go deeper, you to your point with the PhD, the more you realize how much you don't know, right? And we can see these patterns, and we start to say like, yeah, this, and then we get to a point where we're like, okay, but there's still all of this vastness, that there is still there's still a turtle underneath that other turtle somewhere. We just don't know where it is yet. Yeah.
And what do you do with that? Do you worry about counting turtles all the way down, or do you worry about moving across the back in the direction you want, living the life you want, thriving, feeling joy?
I guess for me, it's like there is a sense of like, I guess, wonder, like not so much a worry as much as it is like an awe, like a, you know, a level of like humility that I think that comes with that, as well as there is also a question I think I have around like, you know, in the same way where it's valuable to learn about these brainwaves, which are part of that mystery 20 years ago, right, that didn't exist, like that if we were able to get closer to that thing, would that help us reduce suffering more? Whatever that fully unknowable thing, but if we can get a little bit closer to identifying the elephant that we're all touching while we're blind and stuff, you know, if we can get a little bit closer.
But again, map is not the territory. We don't necessarily need truth.
Right.
I mean, we've also known. Here's the thing: we've been given the truths, or enough of the picture. Maybe we're all blind men and elephants, but we've been given enough of the picture to make massive changes in real people's lives. For 5, 10, 15, 20,000 years, we've had those skills. You know, we were teaching meditation at least 5, 10,000 years ago. Inhibitory tone, sleep regulation, trauma and resilience. Like, you know, we've been doing this stuff for a very long time. And why don't we all have abs? Why aren't we all enlightened? Man, I want my enlightenment. Where's my enlightenment? You know? So we have to be careful not to become Zen masturbators. We have to be careful not to just pursue the phenomena for their own sake. Where is your suffering? Where is your resilience? Where is your growth? That, I think, you know, these concepts, these tools that we're bringing to bear, those are useful because they give us that, not because they are magic boxes. And you'll see in our field, just to comment on what you said about people developing a little bit of a special vibe, there's really two types of people I see in our field that I think get a little bit of a maybe unique perspective on the brain because they see what happens. Now, most of us see huge amounts of suffering, huge amounts of anxiety and trauma, autism, dysregulated sensory issues, huge amounts, alcohol, vast amounts of suffering. More, I would say, than, well, it's an outpatient, you know, if you are external suffering that is often, you know, sort of full catastrophe living for people, and they've turned to everything else, and they find this late. And then you see people change most of the time over a few months, massively. And you get a little blasé about all the miracles you're seeing, and you get this sort of like you're unattached to the suffering, you're unattached to the miracles because they're happening all the time around you. You're like, okay, brains suffer and brains transform. Okay, there's some of that. That's the healthy version of an experienced neurofeedback practitioner developing a deep, and practitioners develop deep understandings of the brain, good ones. that iterate, that learn, that assess. They learn how the brain works as well as anyone else on the planet, I would argue. Then there's a small cadre, maybe 10% or 20% of the field, who are using one-size-fits-all automatic systems that auto-adjust, that don't do assessments, and that believe their tool is magical. Oh, neurofeedback works. It can't cause harm, and you can do as much of it as you want, and it works for all the things. And none of those statements are true. You can create side effects by building your brain in the wrong direction. There are people for whom different protocols have to be used, and not everything's one size fits. So it's a heavily individualized form of personal training of your brain. And it can go awry the same way that personal training can when you do the wrong thing or not what you need. So there's a bit of like people that see this transformation, even if you're using some of these one-size-fits systems, you'll still get amazing transformations some of the time.
Yeah.
And it's really risky to believe you know what you're doing when it comes to the brain. It really is. You have to hold conclusions lightly. You have to not believe you know better than someone else what their experience is. You have to not believe your perspective on their brain map means you know better what they're experiencing when you start doing neurofeedback than what they're doing. But if you can hold that tension of not knowing what is true and having lots of possibilities, then you can watch what is real, which is their experiences day to day, what they're describing as their goals, and you can walk that line of change without having to attach to diagnostic precision. And the ability to see a lot of variability and not attach to it, I think that does create that Buddhist scientist a little bit. Because we see things and just we realize that we can't know them fully, and yet we can know them deeply.
Yeah, that is a really beautiful, I think, extrapolation of that. And it makes a lot of sense, I think, when you're seeing all that. And I think one of my core beliefs is just, ultimately that I don't know anything, right? And like I mentioned like the intellectual humility that comes with that, but just like the reality of being able to say, well, like I'm experiencing this, but I don't know that. Especially in today's day and age, right? You could be an AI that's actually being made somewhere else, and you're just on my screen right now. Like I have no idea that you're there.
I could be on a server right now, exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Although if I was an AI, we would have had fewer audio problems that we figured out.
Not if you were smart enough of an AI, right? Like if you're that level of ahead of us, like I can go down that rabbit hole where it's like, but I think there's something where you are able to hold that tension of the not knowing that is what serves so many of your clients, right? When you are able to come back with that beginner's mind each time and say,
you have to, because you can't know. You can't know better than someone else what their experience is, and you can't know that a feature in someone's brain means X, Y, or Z. You can know it's plausible. You can know that the shapes of it, and if you if you paint it out for somebody, here's some plausible ideas, they will know it's true. And their knowledge, here's the thing too, their knowledge about what that actually means. Let's say I see a frontal asymmetry. Happy little kid is not as happy. Grumpy old man's too activated with beta. I might describe something where their approach system's not online fully and their avoid system's really strong. And that can lead to difficulty with motivation, mood, overwhelm. And if someone's like, oh yeah, that's true, that's why I'm here. Oh yeah, that sucks. I'm like, oh yeah, it does suck. Man, I'm so sorry. And look at it. Your frontal systems, it makes some sense. There it is. And that is very freeing for the person, because then like, great, what can I do about it? Okay, great. Well, your left side responds well to concentration practices with meditation. Classic asymmetry here with the front midline. This is a thing that psychiatrists might be able to give you SSRIs for. This might work well. Or your quirky brain might mean you want to do a methylation analysis, see what genes you have. Maybe MTHFR needs special B vitamins for you. But the perspective of that is not, I found your depression. You are depressed. It's more like, oh, hey, your approach versus avoid system might not be in as, free of a gear as you prefer. Is that true? Not, here's what's true for you. Here's your brain. Is it true that you're suffering in X, Y, or Z direction, or would you like to change your brain in X, Y, and Z direction? That really does give people the control, the agency. And so that's true of all neurofeedback, whether or not somebody realizes it. No matter what provider you're working with, you can do almost infinite number of things. So ask for what you want. Tell them what you're feeling.
Yeah.
It's really important. So
with that, with all the brain data that you've said, and you've mentioned that same idea of like being able to hold the not knowing, the tension, approaching that every single time. And I think when I had Jay Gunkelman on, he was talking about the importance of reading the EEG almost like a blank slate every single time, so that you're able to identify, right, the new patterns that might emerge, and not just be locked into, oh yeah, there's those ones that I see, those are the ones that I see, those are the ones that I see, because our brain will ultimately filter out those other things and then be able to not identify the more nuanced or detailed or other components that come up there. And I'm curious, like, for you, what do you do to be able to maintain that sense of, I guess, beginner's mind within yourself and your work when you, I mean, even to a certain extent, right, you just wrote a book that's like, oh yeah, there are these different phenotypes, and like, I'm sure that you must have some sort of a relationship with
and
those.
not all of them are sort of well, vetted out fully in the research, but some of them are.
Right.
And this is what Jay did too. Jay Gunkelman was working in hospitals, or he's working for a data receiving company who did analysis for hospitals all over the country. They would send their EEGs, recording epileptics and whatever else, and send them in just constantly. And Jay was sitting there scoring data manually, hours a day, and was seeing these same patterns, these same phenotypes, these classic patterns and waveforms that show up. And Jay, along with my more direct mentor in QEEG, a guy named Jack Johnstone, who Jay and Jack had a company together called Qmetrics. Joy Lunt involved with that group, and Jay, Jack, and Joy did a paper called Characterization of EEG Phenotypes. Characterization of Clinical Databases, I think, in EEG. 2005 paper. And that was the first paper that really talked about this idea of endophenotypes, that there's these patterns that cross diagnostic boundaries and keep showing up across brains, but we don't necessarily know what they mean, and they're not always pathological. And at the time the paper was published in 2005, I think there was maybe 8 or 9 phenotypes that were identified in that first paper. Things like the slow and low phenotype. If you're old or have injuries or you're really metabolically depleted, your EEG drops in amplitude and slows down. That's low and slow, low amplitude fast, low amplitude slow. These are variants of EEG that can show up. People have them. They can mean something. So at the time that Jay published that paper, only 2 of the 9 or so phenotypes had been deterministic. Like, here's the genes, here's the phenomena and the physiology that definitely corresponds to it. By the time another 10 years had gone by, all of the rest of them had been validated. And that's all I'm doing, is I'm looking at roughly 25,000 or more brain maps. It's more than 25, but that just sounds good. Right. More than 25,000 at this point. You see the same patterns again and again and again. So I'm just doing the same thing that Jay did, and I look at raw data as well as patterns data, QEEG patterns, and people tend to be quirky in similar ways again and again and again and again and again. Yeah. And not every person's experience of having the same resources in an unusual, pattern, not every person is going to have the same. In fact, I would argue that 2 people with similar unusual features in their brain will still have a very different experience. Yeah. So it's not about here's what is true for you at a deep level. It's more like here's some big features of regulation, stress, attention, sleep. And if you can describe regulatory aspects of yourself and go, oh yeah, the next step, if you understand that model that we're working with, is, well, that gives you things to try, gives you things to manage, gives you things to monitor, gives you things to change. Yeah. And that, I think, is the important part, not so much being tied to the phenotype itself. So I took Jack and Jay's idea about the endophenotypes and ran with it a little bit and said, it's not just the raw signal, the little blip in the EEG. It's not just these 9 things that we have, the genotype that match the phenotype. Instead, a phenotype is the expression as you see it. I mean, in classic biology, phenotype is like what you look like. Genotype are the genes that produce that. Your baldness, my baldness, phenotypes. The thing that we're carrying from our maternal grandfather probably that's related to it, genotype. And in EEG, in the brain, the cortical stuff, they're more changeable, just like you can change your body mass or muscle strength or whatever. The brain's way more changeable than the body, but these are phenotypes the same way. They're largely heritable, You get two identical twins, they'll often have the exact same patterns of phenotypes. They're also acquirable. People experience really strong adverse experiences, and many of us will have the posterior cingulate cramp up into high gear. And is that a trauma response? Yes. For some people, it's PTSD. For other people, they're actual lifeguards. And they're like, have a head in a swivel and it feels really good, or they're a gamer. It's not in the way, it's unusual. So you have to both embrace the difference and not be too attached to it as being a pathological phenomenon. Instead, it requires us to understand our brains. So what I got there was by asking people about their brains. Does this pattern mean what it can mean? Oh, it doesn't. It means that? Interesting. And if you keep getting that from people again and again and again, they teach you what it means. I had a client who came to me for anxiety. She remote client called me and said, okay, so I have a wedding to go to. It's a 10-hour road trip, and it's a 4-day event, and my college roommate invited me to be her maid of honor. Thing is, I haven't left the house in 6 years. I have extreme agoraphobia and major anxiety. Can't get in a car, can't go through the front door. And at the time I was still do a lot of remote neurofeedback, which is why she reached out. So we, sent her a brain map, did a remote program, and she was very successful. She went to the wedding. She had a great time. She didn't have crazy anxiety. And a couple weeks later, I got like all of these people coming in from an agoraphobia support group that she was part of, saying, wait, what? Can I have some? And so over the next month, I ended up doing brain maps on a dozen people with classic diagnostic agoraphobia.
Wow.
And 9 of them had the exact same patterns of activation that were cramped up. I went, oh, okay. And then it's the anterior cingulate. I won't gatekeep the information. The anterior cingulate, which is selecting your thoughts, and the right tempoparietal, taking in the outside world, get cramped up together, and they can produce, among other things, agoraphobia, as well as, ironically, claustrophobia. We think it's the opposite, but it's not. It's the environment pressing on you. Misophonia, irritability and even rage when someone's chewing, or small sounds, or little background things. That's a tic. It's a mental tic. It's a kind of a little obsessiveness mixed with a sensory and social. And you see this co-activation in people, and there's something about the outside world or social things that are really, really driving, and they may be uncomfortable. It may be some social anxiety, maybe some misophonia, maybe some OCD, maybe agoraphobia. Maybe your brain's quirky and this is just normal for you. Great, good job, be weird. But like seeing the quirkiness and saying, this pattern often means that you're really frustrated when people are chewing and you hear their spouse start laughing hysterically in the background because like they're getting threatened nightly about their chewing. It's one of the very few ways that women can end up in prison in mid-years is by killing their husbands who are chewing too loud. Misophonia literally creates prison sentences sometimes. Wow. It's among the very few things, like the OCD things that can get you in jail, is because people, they literally assault their partners because they cannot take the sounds.
Wow. That's wild.
Nails on chalkboard. We all know what that sensation is. Imagine that for any little small sound.
Yeah. Wow.
And often there's a rage, a disinhibition, an anger that comes with it. It's not just OCD, features a little obsessiveness, and you can't ignore it. It becomes rage for some people.
Well, that actually
very uncomfortable.
I know we're kind of running at time right now, but one question I kind of wanted to ask you about that's tied to rage was, you talk a little bit about like the, sensitivity to rejection in particular, and you talked about shame. And I was curious about, just from your perspective, like what is sort of shame, or does shame have a neurological signature or a phenotype at all? I'm somebody who was born and raised in religion and have a lot of shame from that regard, and I know a lot of people who've overcome shame in a lot of different ways. And I'm just curious about what does that look like, and what do you do with it from a neurological perspective?
Yeah. Short answer is you don't see shame per se. The experience, high-level things like that are not things that are visualizable in the tools that I use. I see trait features. Right. However, there is a sort of social, evolutionary, I don't want to say benefit, but there's a reason, there's a rationale for why we feel shame. The social unit has value. The non-genetically tied in people in our group providing care back to the genes, if you will. It's something we select for. There's genes for altruism, for being nice to and caring for other people. And shame seems to be tied into that, where social judgment about behavior that's not socially congruent seems to create that experience. Now, rejection, which is that often a part of it, is also has aspects of attachment and relational things. I do not know you very deeply, but I assume some of the shame that was engendered from growing up that way was about cosmology. Better not masturbate, better not have impure thoughts, better not, and I better not be mean to yell at my parents. Cause
it's almost like creating that inner lifeguard within my mind, essentially, about my behaviors or thoughts.
There is something there. We learn the social rules to keep us safe. And the back of the brain, those sensory and social areas, are going to get sensitized. And that, even with great, therapy and moving through great growth and healing, that may still create for some of us that ease of that tissue being activated. And that sort of leads into that idea of rejection sensitivity and ADHD, where you have that person who's been bullied about their impulsivity and interrupting and everything else for 20 years, and then they have somebody be mean again. And they haven't developed secure attachment necessarily in social environments without always being the person who's knocking something over or talking first. And you have this sensitization. Also, you don't just get ADHD phenomena. You get all kinds of unusual brain things when you have an unusual brain. So you probably are seeing someone's emotions more deeply than they are trying to express. You probably are noticing the frustration in their tone of voice. Now, it might not be about you. But since they're not guarding it and you're picking it up, you may attach with that right tempoparietal tissue, the princess. And then if you're judging it as negative, if the grumpy old man or the problem child are activated, suddenly you're shutting down. Well, screw them. Now it's like the splitting thing where you're like, I want to be my friend. I want to be well, screw you. You pull away and protect and resist. So I think those are all related. There's good research out of UCSD showing that the in-group versus out-group stuff, which is the basis of like all kinds of horrors in the past million years. But it leads to some of the racism that we experience, but also some of the classism that we deal with. And that has some similar aspects too. There's a management of resources by groups of people. I think that's the core feature, but it taps into the social and the sensory. And to answer the last part of your question, how do you work with it? You work with the social and sensory tissue, I would say, or work with some of the attachment and relational tissues. You can do work directly. You can do things like IFS or DBT or CBT. You can do neurofeedback. You can do all of them. These are changeable tissues. That I think is more important than how. That you can make change is what we want to hold on to.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Andrew. I mean, you're always welcome back on my show. I can always talk to you for 1,000 more hours and ask you more questions. I guess before we sign off, one question I always ask my guests is just, what's one question you might have for the audience, or to have them think about something in a different way, or something that might shift their perspective?
Yeah. So all of the phenotypes that I have in the book really end up being related to core features in the brain. And I think of the foundation of that as stress, sleep, and attention. So 3 legs of a stool. And I want you guys to think about those things not just operating on their own, but being interrelated. Sleep and attention and stress and sleep. These are all actually sharing resources. So I would invite you just to observe if your sleep is thrown off, how your attention is, how your stress response is, and vice versa. Look at how those things interact maybe a little bit. And if you do want to see more about the 12 phenotypes, come to the website, giftedandtortured.com, fill out the quiz. I have a cute little quiz. I'll send you results. And you can check yourself out there at a deeper level if you wish. Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. And anywhere else you want to send people to before we sign off? Yeah, maybe peakbraininstitute.com. If you want to grab a brain map, we have offices all over the place. New York City, West Palm Beach, St. Louis, Los Angeles, Orange County, London, Stockholm. There's a few others. In the U.S., you can do remote brain mapping anywhere in the U.S. you wish. We'll send you out equipment. But if you want to learn your brain, come check us out. On the Peak Brain Institute website, I have free call links as well. So if you want to talk about something deeply, just grab a 30-minute call. Part of a Peak Brain doing something a bit different is we're scientists and coaches. We're not doctors, in spite of some of us having PhDs. So we remain accessible. We're there to talk to you. We're there, to help you learn this stuff. So if you're wondering about how your brain works, come talk to us. Love to teach you.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Well, have to have you on again. Ciao.
Definitely.